In the biting winter of 1892, the Duke of Blackwood was the most feared man in Yorkshire, not for his temper, but for his silence. They called him the Ghost of the Moors, a man who locked his gates to the world after a scandal that no newspaper dared to print. But fate has a way of knocking when you least expect it. One night, during the worst blizzard of the decade, a woman collapsed at his threshold. He didn't save her out of love. He saved her out of cold duty. But as the fire thawed her frozen skin, he discovered she wasn't just a stranger seeking shelter. She was hiding a secret beneath her tattered coat, a secret that bore his own blue eyes and would force him to burn down his entire world to protect. The wind howled against the stone walls of Blackwood Manor like a dying beast. It was December 24th, 1892, a night where the snow didn't fall so much as it attacked, driving horizontally across the bleak moors of Yorkshire. Inside the library, the fire was roaring, but Clarice Sterling, the 8th Duke of Blackwood, felt none of its warmth. Clarice stood by the towering window, watching the whiteout consume his estate. At 32, he possessed the kind of sharp, devastating handsomeness that usually made women swoon in London ballrooms. But here, in the isolation of the north, his face was a mask of granite. He swirled the amber whiskey in his crystal glass, the liquid catching the firelight. "Your Grace," a voice croaked from the doorway. It was Higgins, his aging butler, the only man Clarice tolerated. "I told you I wasn't to be disturbed, Higgins. Not tonight, especially not tonight," Clarice said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know, sir. But the dogs. They're frantic. They found something at the north gate." Clarice turned, his brow furrowed. The north gate was 3 miles from the main house, accessible only by the old service road, which would be buried under 5 feet of drift by now. A deer, likely, or a wolf. Let the groundskeepers deal with it. "It's not an animal, Your Grace," Higgins said, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them behind his back. The keeper brought it up on the sleigh. "It's a woman." Clarice's glass paused halfway to his lips. A woman. Out there. She must be mad or dead. Barely alive, sir. And she is not alone. Clarice set the glass down with a sharp clink. He strode past Higgins, his long coat billowing behind him like a dark shadow. He marched through the drafty corridors of the manor, down to the servants' hall where the chaos was unfolding. The atmosphere in the kitchens was usually disciplined, but tonight it was frantic. Maids were running with basins of hot water and heated towels. On the large wooden table, usually reserved for kneading dough, lay a bundle of wet, grey wool. Clarice pushed through the crowd of servants. "Make way." The silence was instantaneous. The staff parted. Lying on the table was a figure so slight she looked like a child. Her skin was the colour of marble, blue-veined and terrifyingly cold. Her lips were cracked, her hair a matted mess of ice and dark brown strands. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged, a terrifying rattle in her chest. "Who is she?" Clarice demanded, looking at the head groundskeeper, Thomas. "No idea, Your Grace," Thomas said, wiping snow from his beard. "Found her curled up against the iron bars. She was trying to climb over by the looks of it. Her hands are torn to ribbons." Clarice looked down at her hands. They were raw, bloody, and frozen. Desperation. That was the only thing that drove a woman to climb an iron gate in a blizzard. "Cut the clothes off," Clarice ordered. "Get her into a warm bath, but not hot. Shock will kill her faster than the cold. Higgins, send for Dr. Arris. I don't care if he has to ski here." "Yes, Your Grace." As the maids moved in with shears to cut away the sodden wool coat, Clarice turned to leave. He had done his duty. He was a duke, not a nursemaid. Whatever tragedy had befallen this creature was not his concern beyond basic Christian charity. "Wait," one of the maids, a young girl named Sarah, gasped. Clarice stopped at the door. "What is it?" "Sir, look." The heavy wool coat fell open. Underneath, the woman wore a dress that had once been fine silk, now ruined by mud and travel, but it wasn't the dress that drew every eye in the room. It was the swell of her stomach. She was heavily pregnant. Clarisse felt a strange, cold jolt in his chest, distinct from the winter air. A pregnant woman, alone, miles from civilization, trying to break into his estate. He walked back to the table, staring down at her. Now that the coat was gone, he could see the curve of her jaw more clearly. She looked famished, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut, but there was a fragility to her that seemed familiar. He reached out, his leather-gloved hand hovering over her face. He brushed a wet lock of hair from her forehead. A scar, a tiny, crescent-shaped scar just above her left eyebrow. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The noise of the kitchen, the boiling water, the whispering maids, the howling wind, vanished into a ringing silence. Clarisse ripped his glove off. He touched the scar with his bare thumb, his heart hammering a rhythm he hadn't felt in 2 years. "Lydia?" he whispered. It was impossible. Lydia Cross had died in the fire at the Savoy Theatre in London 2 years ago. He had attended the memorial. He had worn black for 6 months. He had buried the engagement ring he intended to give her in the family crypt because he couldn't bear to look at it. But the scar remained. He remembered how she got it, falling from a swing in her father's orchard when they were children. "Clear the room!" Clarisse snarled, his voice changing from commanding to possessive. "Everyone out, now!" "But Your Grace, she needs—" the housekeeper started. "I said out!" Clarisse roared, slamming his hand onto the table. "Leave Sarah and Higgins. The rest of you, go!" The room scrambled. When the door clicked shut, Clarisse leaned over the unconscious woman. He grabbed her freezing hand, pressing it to his cheek, ignoring the blood and dirt. "Lydia!" he choked out, the ice around his heart cracking violently. "Who did this to you?" And then her eyes fluttered. They didn't open, but a whimper escaped her blue lips. Her hand spasmed in his. "The letter," she mumbled, delirious. "Don't let him find the letter." "Who?" Clarisse demanded, leaning close to her ear. "Who is chasing you?" She didn't answer. Her head lolled to the side, unconsciousness claiming her again. Clarisse looked at her swollen stomach. If this was Lydia, she had been gone for 2 years. 2 years. The child could not be his. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The joy of finding her alive collided instantly with the sickening gut punch of betrayal. She had been alive. She had been with someone else. And now she was back, broken and pregnant with another man's child, begging for help. His jaw tightened. The sympathy evaporated, replaced by the old familiar bitterness. "Get her to the blue room," Clarisse said coldly, dropping her hand as if it burned him. "Lock the door, and bring me whatever was in her pockets." The blue room was the coldest guest room in the manor, usually reserved for unwanted relatives. But it was secure. Clarisse paced his study, the storm outside mirroring the tempest in his mind. Higgins entered quietly, carrying a silver tray. On it lay a small, sodden velvet pouch and a folded, water-damaged envelope. "These were pinned to the inside of her corset, Your Grace," Higgins said, his eyes averted. He knew better than to look at the Duke when he was in this state. Clarisse took the pouch first. He upended it onto his mahogany desk. A ring tumbled out. It spun on the wood before settling. A sapphire surrounded by diamonds. Clarisse stopped breathing. It wasn't the engagement ring he had buried. It was his mother's ring. He had given it to Lydia the night before the fire, a promise of what was to come. She hadn't been wearing it when they found the bodies, or the bodies they thought were hers. She had kept it. For 2 years, through hell and high water, she had kept the sterling sapphire. He reached for the letter. The ink was running, the paper pulpy and fragile. He unfolded it with surgical care. It wasn't a letter to him. It was a contract. To Lord Harrington, payment received for the removal of the obstacle. L. Cross, the asylum in Switzerland, confirms receipt of the patient. She will be registered under the name Jane Doe. The child, if born, will be disposed of as agreed. The Sterling estate must remain unaware. Signed, Dr. E. Thorne. Clarice read it twice, then a third time. Harrington, Lord Arthur Harrington, Clarice's own cousin. The man who stood next to him at the memorial service, looking solemn, patting Clarice on the back, whispering that it was for the best, and that Clarice should focus on the estate. Harrington, who was next in line for the dukedom if Clarice died heirless. A low, guttural sound escaped Clarice's throat. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a predator recognizing its prey. Lydia hadn't run away. She hadn't left him for another man. She had been taken. Removal of the obstacle. They had put her in an asylum. Clarice looked at the date on the contract. It was dated 1 month after the fire. And the child? He did the math. If she had been gone 2 years, the child was conceived recently. In the asylum? The thought made bile rise in his throat. Had she been abused? Assaulted? But then he noticed something else in the velvet pouch. A smaller piece of paper, folded into a tiny square, dry and preserved. He opened it. It was in Lydia's handwriting, though shaky, as if written in the dark. Clarice, if you are reading this, I have failed to reach you. But you must know, the fire was a diversion. I was taken that night. I was pregnant then, Clarice. Our son was born 7 months later in the dark. They took him. They told me he died. But I heard him cry, this child I carry now. I fought them off, Clarice. I escaped, but I am weak. This baby is innocent. But the first, our son, Harrington, has him. He is raising your heir as a servant in his own house to mock you. Find him. Lydia. The paper fluttered from Clarice's fingers to the floor. The room spun. 2 secrets. Not one. The child in her womb was not his. It was likely the product of whatever hell she had endured in that asylum, a thought that made him want to burn the world down. But there was another. A son. His son. Alive. Living as a servant under the roof of the man who stole his life. Clarice walked to the fireplace. He stared at the flames, his reflection in the mirror above the mantel shifting from the broken man of the last 2 years into something harder, something lethal. Higgins, Clarice said. His voice was no longer loud. It was terrifyingly quiet. Your Grace? Wake the stablemaster. Prepare the carriage, not the open one. The armoured coach. Sir, the blizzard, I don't care if the snow is 10 feet deep. We are going to London. But first, Clarice turned, his eyes burning with a cold blue fire. Move her from the blue room to my chambers. Get the best midwives in the county. If she dies, every person in this house answers to me. And the intruder, sir. What shall we tell the staff? Tell them nothing, Clarice said, picking up the contract and the ring. He slid the ring onto his pinky finger. It only went halfway down, but he clenched his fist around it. Tell them the Duchess has returned home. Clarice strode out of the study, the contract crunched in his fist. He wasn't just a duke anymore. He was a father, and he was a husband who had failed his wife once. He would not fail her again. He went up the stairs, 2 at a time, towards the room where Lydia lay. He needed answers. He needed to know if she could hear him. When he entered the room, the heat hit him. The maids had built up the fire. Lydia was under a mountain of quilts, her face pale against the white pillows. Dr. Aris had arrived miraculously fast, likely coincidentally nearby, attending a birth in the village. The doctor looked up, his face grave. Your Grace, it's not good. Speak plainly, Aris. She is in labor. The trauma, the cold. The body is expelling the child to save itself. But she is too weak. I can save the child, or I can try to save the mother. I likely cannot do both. Clarice froze at the foot of the bed. The choice. The impossible choice. He looked at Lydia, the love of his life, broken and battered. Then he looked at the mound of the quilt, where the unborn, innocent child lay. A child that wasn't his, but was hers. Save her, Clarice said without hesitation. Save Lydia. Sir, Dr. Aris hesitated. "The baby! I said save her!" Clarice roared, stepping forward. "I have lost her once to fire. I will not lose her to ice." But just then, Lydia's hand shot out from under the covers. She grabbed Clarice's wrist with a grip of surprising strength. Her eyes flew open. They were glassy, feverish, but they found his. "No," she rasped. "Clarice, I'm here, Lydia. I'm here." He dropped to his knees beside the bed. "The baby," she gasped, sweat beading on her forehead. "You must save the baby. Lydia, no. You can have other children. We can— You don't understand," she cried out, her body arching in pain as a contraction hit her. She pulled him closer, her nails digging into his skin. "The dates. The letter. I lied." Clarice frowned. "What?" "I lied in the note. Just in case Harrington intercepted it, I couldn't let him know the truth." She sobbed, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. "There was no other man. I was never touched. I fought them. I hid." She looked down at her stomach, then back at him, her eyes pleading. "This is not a stranger, Clarice. It's been a long time. Gestation. The doctors in the asylum said it was a phenomenon. Suspended. I don't know." She was delirious, her words failing. "But I feel it. I know it." She gripped his hand tighter. "This is your daughter, Clarice, and she is the only thing that kept me alive." The monitor of her heart seemed to be her grip on his hand. It was fading. "Save her," Lydia whispered, her eyes rolling back. "Please." Clarice looked at Dr. Aris. The room was spinning again. Suspended gestation? It was medically impossible. A miracle? Or the delusions of a woman, driven mad by torture? It didn't matter. It was what she wanted. Clarice stood up, his face a mask of agony. "Do it," he told the doctor. "Do whatever you have to do to save them both. If you lose either of them, you better start running." Clarice backed away into the shadows of the room as the doctor pulled out his instruments. He watched the woman he loved scream in agony, the storm raging outside, knowing that miles away, in the warmth of a London mansion, Lord Harrington was sleeping soundly. Clarice looked out the window at the black night. "Sleep well, cousin," he whispered, "because the devil is coming for you." While the blizzard raged in Yorkshire, 300 miles south in London, the fire in Lord Arthur Harrington's drawing room was polite, contained, and fueled by expensive coal. Arthur Harrington stood by the mantel, admiring his reflection in the gilded mirror. He was a handsome man in a soft, pampered way, with slicked-back blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He held a glass of sherry, savoring the sweetness of a life he hadn't earned. "Boy," Arthur snapped, not bothering to turn his head. A small shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. A child, no more than 4 years old, stepped forward. He was dressed in rags that were 3 sizes too big, his face smudged with soot from cleaning the grate. He held a heavy coal scuttle with trembling arms. "Yes, my lord," the boy whispered. He didn't have a name. Or rather, he wasn't allowed to use it. The staff called him Leo, but Arthur called him Mongrel. "My glass is empty," Arthur said, extending his hand without looking. "Refill it, and try not to spill it this time, or you'll sleep in the cellar with the rats again." Leo stepped forward, struggling with the heavy crystal decanter. He was small for his age, malnourished, but his movements had a strange, innate grace. He lifted the bottle. Crash. The decanter was too heavy. It slipped from his soot-stained fingers and shattered on the hearth, splashing sherry onto Arthur's polished Italian leather shoes. The silence in the room was deafening. Arthur looked down at his ruined shoes, then he looked at the boy. "I'm sorry," Leo gasped, dropping to his knees to pick up the glass shards with his bare hands. "I'm sorry, sir. It slipped." Arthur didn't yell. He simply sighed, a sound of exaggerated disappointment. He reached out and grabbed a handful of the boy's dark, curly hair, yanking his head back. "Look at me," Arthur whispered. Leo looked up, tears streaming down his face, and there they were, The Blackwood eyes, those piercing sapphire blue eyes that belonged to only one family in England, the Sterlings. The eyes of the cousin Arthur had betrayed. Every time Arthur looked at the boy, he saw Clarice, and he hated him for it. "You're clumsy, just like your mother was," Arthur sneered. She didn't know her place either. He shoved the boy backward. Leo fell hard onto the rug, cutting his palm on a shard of glass. "Get out of my sight," Arthur said, wiping his hands on a silk handkerchief. "No dinner for you tonight, and tell Mrs. Gable that if I see you above stairs again, you'll be on the street." Leo scrambled up and ran from the room, clutching his bleeding hand. Arthur watched him go, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He took a sip from the remaining sherry in the bottle. He had won. He had the money, he had the status, and soon, when Clarice finally drank himself to death in that frozen castle up north, Arthur would have the title of Duke. He had no idea that the ghost of the Moors was currently tearing through the countryside, coming for his throat. Back at Blackwood Manor, the scream that tore through the bedroom was raw and primal. Clarice stood in the corner, his back pressed against the wall, his hands gripping the velvet curtains so hard the fabric tore. He had faced armed men. He had hunted wolves, but he had never felt fear like this. "One more push, Your Grace. Stay with me," Dr. Arris commanded, his voice tight. Lydia was pale as death, her hair plastered to her skull. She was fading. The monitors of her life, her breath, her pulse, were slowing down. "I can't," she whispered, her head lolling back. "Lydia!" Clarice lunged forward, ignoring the blood, ignoring the propriety. He grabbed her face between his hands. "Look at me! You walked through a blizzard for this child. Do not give up now. You fight, Lydia Cross. You fight." She opened her eyes. She saw the blue fire in his gaze, the ferocity of his love. It sparked something in her, the last ember of strength. She screamed, a sound of pure defiance, and pushed with everything she had left. A high, thin wail filled the room. Dr. Arris moved quickly. "It's a girl," he announced, his voice filled with relief. "A living girl." He quickly wrapped the infant in a warm towel and handed her to the nurse to clean, but his attention immediately snapped back to Lydia. "She's hemorrhaging," Dr. Arris said sharply. "Get the hot irons. Raise the foot of the bed, now." Clarice was shoved aside by the nurses. He watched in horror as the bedsheets turned crimson. The room became a blur of frantic motion. "Clarice!" The whisper was so faint he almost missed it. He pushed past the doctor, falling to his knees beside her head. "I'm here." "The boy," Lydia breathed, her eyes unfocused. "Leo, his name is Leo." "Leo," Clarice repeated, engraving the name onto his soul. "I will find him. I swear it." "And the baby?" She looked towards the bundle in the nurse's arms. "She is yours. Clarice, the masquerade, in London, 9 months ago. You were in the garden. You thought I was a dream." Clarice's heart stopped. The memory hit him like a lightning bolt. 9 months ago. He had been in London for a mandatory session of Parliament. He had been drunk, wandering the gardens of his townhouse, mourning her. He remembered a woman in a cloak appearing from the shadows. He remembered her scent, lavender and rain. He remembered holding her, weeping into her shoulder, and the desperate, passionate night that followed in the garden folly. When he woke up, he was alone. He had convinced himself it was a hallucination, a mercy from his broken mind. But it had been her. She had escaped, found him, tried to tell him, but must have been snatched away again before dawn. "It was you," Clarice choked out, tears finally spilling over. "It was always you." "Protect them." Lydia's eyes fluttered shut. Her hand went limp in his. "Lydia!" Clarice roared. Dr. Arre stepped in, his hands covered in blood. "Your Grace, you must let me work. If you stay, you distract us. If you leave, I might save her." Clarice looked at the woman he loved, hovering between worlds. Then he looked at the crying infant girl, his daughter, in the corner. He stood up. He felt cold, colder than the blizzard outside. He walked over to the nurse, looked down at the tiny, red-faced baby with a tuft of black hair. He touched her cheek with one finger. "Watch over your mother, Clara," he whispered, naming her after his grandmother, a warrior queen of a woman. He turned to Dr. Aris. "You save her. I have a monster to kill." The armoured carriage tore up the cobblestones of London like a hearse on a rampage. It was 3 days later. The blizzard had broken, but the roads were treacherous. Clarisse hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He existed only on coffee and rage. He had left Lydia in a stable but critical condition. She was in a coma, her body fighting to replenish the blood she had lost. But she was alive. That was enough fuel for Clarisse. The carriage screeched to a halt in front of a modest townhouse in Chelsea. It wasn't Harrington's house. It was the residence of Mr. Silas Vane, a private investigator who owed Clarisse his life. Clarisse kicked the door open and stormed up the steps. Silas opened the door before Clarisse could knock, looking at the Duke's dishevelled appearance. "I heard you were back in town," Silas said, stepping aside. "You look like hell, Your Grace." "I need eyes inside Harrington House," Clarisse said, bypassing pleasantries. "Tonight." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Harrington? Your cousin? He's hosting the winter solstice ball tonight. Half of Parliament will be there." "Perfect," Clarisse said, a grim smile cutting across his face. "Get me a disguise. Not a mask. A uniform." "You want to go in as a guest?" "No," Clarisse said. "I want to go in as a ghost. I need to see what happens in that house when the guests aren't looking. I need to find a boy, 4 years old. Name is Leo." Silas paused, sensing the gravity. "Is he?" "He is my son," Clarisse said, the words heavy in the air. "And Harrington has him working as a slave." Silas's face hardened. He went to a chest in the corner and pulled out a bundle of clothes. "Harrington hires extra footmen for these large events. High turnover. They don't check references. I have a livery suit here that should fit you. It's for the catering staff." 20 minutes later, the Duke of Blackwood was gone. In his place stood a tall, imposing man with slicked-back hair, wearing the gold and black livery of a serving man. He had rubbed coal dust into his stubble to darken his jaw and applied a subtle stain to his skin to look weather-beaten. He looked like a man who had seen hard labour, not a peer of the realm. Harrington House was a palace of light and music. Carriages lined the street, depositing women in jewels and men in sashes. Clarisse entered through the servants' entrance in the alley. The kitchen was a chaotic hive of activity. "You there, new man!" the head butler barked at Clarisse. "Grab that tray of champagne. The East Wing. Move!" Clarisse took the heavy silver tray, keeping his head down. He moved through the corridors, his eyes scanning every face. He wasn't looking for aristocrats. He was looking for the shadows. He moved through the ballroom, invisible to the people who would usually bow to him. He saw Harrington holding court near the orchestra, laughing loudly, his hand resting possessively on the waist of a young debutante. Clarisse's grip on the tray tightened until the metal groaned. "Not yet," he told himself. "Find the boy first." He slipped away from the party, moving towards the upper floors where the family quarters were. He navigated the hallways with the instinct of a hunter. On the 3rd floor, he heard it. A soft, muffled crying coming from a broom closet. Clarisse set the tray down on a hallway table. He approached the narrow door and turned the handle, locked. "Who's in there?" he whispered. The crying stopped instantly. "Please, I didn't steal the bread, I promise." The voice shattered Clarisse's heart. He didn't bother with the key. He placed his boot against the lock and shoved. The wood splintered, and the door swung open. Curled up among mops and buckets, sleeping on a pile of dirty rags, was a small boy. He was shivering, clutching a crust of mouldy bread. Clarisse knelt, filling the small space. The boy pressed himself against the back wall, terrified. "Don't hit me," the boy whimpered, raising his hands to protect his face. Clarisse saw the hands, scarred, calloused, burned. He saw the face, smudged with soot, but undeniable. The structure of the jaw, the nose, and when the boy looked up, the eyes. Blue, sterling blue. It was like looking in a mirror through the tunnel of time. "I'm not going to hit you," Clarice said, his voice trembling. He slowly lowered his hands. "My name is Clarice. What is your name?" The boy hesitated. "They call me Mongrel, or Boy." "No," Clarice said firmly. "What did your mother call you?" The boy's eyes widened. "Mama?" He whispered the word like a prayer. She called me Leo." "Leo," Clarice repeated gently. "Leo Sterling." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the sapphire ring he had taken from Lydia. He held it up to the dim light. "Do you know this ring?" Leo gasped. "Mamma's pretty stone. She gave it to me when the bad men came. But Mr. Arthur took it away. He hit me and took it." That was all the confirmation Clarice needed. The rage that had been simmering in his gut exploded into a cold, focused determination. "Leo," Clarice said, reaching out, "I am going to take you out of here. Tonight." "We can't," Leo whispered, looking at the door. "Mr. Arthur says if I leave, he'll kill Mama. He says she's in a box in the ground. But if I'm bad, he'll hurt her even more." Clarice closed his eyes for a second, fighting the urge to go downstairs and murder Harrington with his bare hands in front of 300 witnesses. "Your mother is not in the ground," Clarice said, opening his eyes. "She is safe. She sent me." He unbuttoned his livery jacket and wrapped it around the shivering boy. "Come with me." They stepped out into the hallway. But as they turned the corner towards the back stairs, a voice rang out. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Clarice froze. He turned slowly. Standing at the end of the hall was Arthur Harrington. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by 2 large men, his personal bodyguards. Arthur squinted at the tall servant holding the boy. He took a step closer, confused. The servant was too tall, too broad, and stood with an arrogance that no footman should possess. "Put the brat down," Arthur sneered, "and turn around. I want to see the face of the thief stealing my property." Clarice turned fully. He lifted his chin. He didn't speak. He just stared. Arthur's face went slack. The glass of wine in his hand slipped, shattering on the floor, echoing the accident Leo had had earlier. "Clarice," Arthur whispered, his face draining of colour. You're in Yorkshire." "I was," Clarice said, his voice echoing in the corridor. "But then a bird flew into my window. A bird carrying a secret you thought you had buried." Clarice took a step forward, shielding Leo behind him. "You stole my wife. You stole my son. And you tried to steal my title." Clarice reached down and picked up an iron poker from the fireplace stand in the hallway. He weighed it in his hand. "The party is over, Arthur." Arthur panicked. "Guards! Kill him! He's an intruder! Kill him!" The 2 bodyguards, thugs from the East End who didn't recognize the Duke, pulled out knives and lunged. The hallway erupted into violence. The first bodyguard, a brute with a scar across his nose, lunged with a serrated knife. He expected a servant who would cower. Instead, he met a duke who had spent his youth boxing in the underground clubs of Soho before he inherited the title. Clarice didn't retreat. He stepped into the attack. He caught the man's wrist with his left hand, twisting it with a sickening crunch, and drove the iron poker into the man's kneecap. The guard howled and collapsed. The second guard hesitated. That split second was his undoing. Clarice swung the heavy iron rod like a saber, striking the man across the temple. He went down hard, unconscious before he hit the floor. It had taken less than 10 seconds. Arthur Harrington stood frozen, his mouth agape, staring at the violence. The veneer of the civilized aristocrat vanished, leaving only a terrified coward. You're insane," Arthur stammered, backing away. "I'm a father," Clarice spat, stepping over the groaning body of the first guard. He reached out a hand to Leo, who was pressing himself into the wallpaper, wide-eyed. "Come here, Leo. Hold my coat. Don't let go." Leo grabbed the tail of the livery coat, his small knuckles white. Arthur turned and ran. He sprinted toward the double doors at the end of the hall, the doors that led to the balcony overlooking the grand ballroom. "Help! Murder! Intruder!" Arthur screamed, bursting through the doors onto the mezzanine. Below, the orchestra faltered and stopped. 300 guests looked up. The chatter died instantly. They saw their host, the charming Lord Harrington, dishevelled and screaming, looking back at the dark hallway as if the devil himself were coming. And then the devil appeared. Clarice stepped onto the balcony. He was blooded. His servant's livery was torn. He held the iron poker in one hand and the hand of a ragged child in the other. He looked wild, terrifying, and magnificent. "Seize him!" Arthur shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Clarice. "He's a madman. He attacked my staff. He's trying to kidnap this child." 2 uniformed policemen, hired for security, started to move through the crowd towards the stairs. Clarice didn't run. He walked to the railing of the balcony, looking down at the sea of faces. Faces he knew. Peers, judges, generals. "Stay back!" Clarice's voice boomed. It wasn't a shout. It was a command that rattled the crystal chandeliers. It was the voice of the Blackwood bloodline. He looked directly at the chief of police, Sir Malcolm, who was standing near the punch bowl. "Sir Malcolm," Clarice said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm, "if your men take one more step, I will throw Lord Harrington off this balcony." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "Who are you?" Sir Malcolm demanded, squinting up at the bloodied servant. Clarice reached up and wiped the coal dust and sweat from his face with his sleeve. He stood to his full height, radiating an aura of power that no livery suit could hide. "I am Clarice Sterling, Duke of Blackwood." Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. "Blackwood?" a woman whispered loudly. "But he's a recluse. He never leaves the north." "And this," Clarice continued, pulling Leo forward gently, "is my son. The son Lord Harrington told me was dead. The son he has kept as a slave in this very house for 3 years." Arthur's face turned a sickly shade of grey. "Lies! He's lying! The man is an impostor. The boy is a stray, a mongrel orphan I took in out of charity." Clarice looked down at Leo. "Show them, Leo." The boy, terrified but trusting the tall man who fought for him, looked up. The ballroom lights hit his face. A murmur started in the front row. It spread like wildfire. "The eyes," an old duchess gasped. "Look at the boy's eyes." "And look at the chin," another man said. "He is the spitting image of the old duke." Clarice turned to Arthur. The poker clattered to the floor. Clarice didn't need a weapon anymore. The truth was sharper. "You paid Dr. Thorne to fake my wife's death," Clarice said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You locked her in an asylum. You stole my son. You did it all for a title you are not fit to wipe your boots with." Arthur backed up until he hit the balcony railing. "You have no proof. It's your word against mine." "Actually," a new voice spoke from the entrance of the ballroom. Silas Vane, the private investigator, walked in. Behind him were 2 Swiss officials and a man in handcuffs, Dr. Thorne. "We have the contract, Lord Harrington," Silas said, holding up the water-damaged paper Clarice had found in Lydia's corset. "And, Doctor, Thorne here has been very chatty since we intercepted him trying to board a boat to America." Arthur looked at the contract. He looked at the crowd, whose expressions had shifted from confusion to disgust. He looked at Clarice, who was watching him with cold, hard satisfaction. It was over. Arthur's knees gave way. He slumped against the railing, sobbing. "I only wanted what was fair. You had everything. You always had everything." "I had nothing," Clarice said softly, picking Leo up into his arms, "until tonight." Clarice turned his back on his cousin. "Sir Malcolm, take him away. If I ever see him again, I will not be so restrained." As the police swarmed the stairs to arrest Arthur Harrington, the crowd parted for Clarice. He walked down the grand staircase, carrying his son, blood on his shirt and pride in his heart. He didn't stop for handshakes. He didn't stop for explanations. He walked straight out the front door, into the cold London night, where the carriage was waiting to take them home. The journey back to Yorkshire took 4 days. The snow had returned, turning the roads into treacherous paths of ice, but Clarice refused to stop for more than a few hours at a time. Inside the carriage, the dynamic was fragile. Leo sat on the opposite bench, wrapped in a fur blanket that cost more than the house he had been sleeping in. He stared out the window, his small hand clutching a wooden soldier Clarice had bought him at a station stop. Clarice watched him, his heart aching. He wanted to hug the boy, to crush him to his chest and never let go, but he knew Leo was like a wounded animal. Sudden movements scared him. Loud noises made him flinch. "Are we going to the cold place?" Leo asked quietly, not looking away from the window. "Yes," Clarice said gently, "but inside it is warm. There are fireplaces in every room, and food, as much food as you want, and no one will ever make you work again." Leo turned his blue eyes to Clarice. "Is Mama really there?" Clarice swallowed the lump in his throat. He had received a telegram from Dr. Ari just before they left London. Stable, weak. Pray. "She is there," Clarice said. "She is sleeping. She is very tired because she fought very hard to come back to us." "Mr. Arthur said she was dead," Leo whispered. "He said she went to hell because she was bad." Clarice moved across the carriage. He sat next to Leo and slowly, carefully put his arm around the boy's shoulders. When Leo didn't pull away, Clarice exhaled. "Mr. Arthur was a liar," Clarice said firmly. "Your mother is the best person I have ever known. She is an angel, Leo, and she loves you more than anything in the world." Leo leaned his head against Clarice's arm. "Okay," he whispered, and for the first time in years, the boy fell asleep feeling safe. When the carriage finally pulled through the iron gates of Blackwood Manor, the estate was transformed. The staff had cleared the snow. Lanterns were lit along the driveway, casting a golden glow against the twilight. Higgins was waiting at the door. As Clarice carried a sleeping Leo up the steps, the old butler's eyes filled with tears. "Is that?" Higgins choked out. "This is Leo," Clarice said softly. "My son." Higgins covered his mouth to stifle a sob. Praise be, praise be." "How is she?" Clarice asked, his voice tight. "She woke up an hour ago, Your Grace. She is weak. Dr. Ari says the fever broke, but she is fragile." Clarice didn't wait. He carried Leo up the grand staircase, past the portraits of ancestors who stared down at the new air. He reached the master bedroom. The door was ajar. Inside, the fire was crackling. A cradle stood near the bed. Clarice walked in. Lydia was propped up on pillows. She looked impossibly thin, her skin translucent, but her eyes were open. She was watching the cradle where the newborn baby girl slept. When she heard the footsteps, she turned her head. Her eyes widened. She tried to sit up, but her strength failed her. "Clarice," she rasped. Clarice walked to the side of the bed. He sat on the edge, shifting the sleeping boy in his arms so she could see him. "Lydia," Clarice whispered. "Look." Lydia looked at the boy. She saw the dark curls, the curve of his cheek. "Leo," she breathed. The sound was barely a ghost of a whisper. At the sound of his name, Leo stirred. He rubbed his eyes and sat up in Clarice's lap. He looked around the room, confused, until his gaze landed on the woman in the bed. He froze. He looked at Clarice, seeking confirmation. Clarice nodded. "Go on." Leo scrambled off Clarice's lap. He approached the bed slowly, as if approaching a holy relic. He reached out a hesitant hand and touched Lydia's arm. "Mama!" Lydia let out a sob that broke Clarice's heart all over again. She reached out with trembling arms and pulled the boy onto the bed. She buried her face in his neck, weeping uncontrollably. "My baby," she cried. "My sweet boy. I thought I lost you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Leo didn't cry. He just held on to her, his small hands gripping her nightgown, burying his face in her shoulder. "You came back," he mumbled into her hair. "The tall man said you would." Clarisse watched them, tears streaming down his face unashamedly. He felt a tug at his sleeve. It was the nurse, holding the newborn baby girl. "She needs her father, Your Grace," the nurse whispered. Clarisse took the tiny bundle. He looked down at his daughter, the miracle that had kept Lydia alive, the secret she had carried through the snow. He walked over to the bed and sat down, encompassing them all in his arms. Lydia looked up at him, her eyes red, but shining with a light that hadn't been there for years. "You found him," she whispered. "We found each other," Clarisse said, kissing her forehead. "We are all here, and no one is ever leaving this house again." The wind howled outside, battering the stone walls of Blackwood Manor. But inside, for the first time in a decade, there was no cold. There was only the warmth of a fire and the sound of a family made whole. However, as the night settled and the joy of reunion calmed, a shadow lingered. Dr. Aris beckoned Clarisse to the hallway. "Your Grace," the doctor said, his face grave. "The Duchess, she is happy. But the damage to her heart from the cold and the years of malnutrition, it is severe. She has weeks, maybe months of recovery. But there is something else you need to know about the asylum where she was kept." Clarisse's smile faded. "What is it?" "She mentioned a name in her fever," Dr. Aris said. "Before she woke up, she said, 'They didn't just take my son. They took samples.' She kept repeating that, Doctor. Thorne was experimenting, writing papers on bloodlines." Clarisse felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Dr. Aris lowered his voice, "that Arthur Harrington might have been the one who paid for her capture, but he wasn't the one running the asylum. Someone else was funding Dr. Thorne, someone who was interested in the Sterling bloodline specifically. And until we know who that is, none of you are truly safe." Clarisse looked back into the bedroom, where Lydia was singing a lullaby to Leo and the baby. The peace was real, but it was fragile. The war with Harrington was over. But a new, darker war was just beginning. The snow did not leave the Yorkshire moors easily. It clung to the valleys and the shadow of the stone walls for months. But eventually, even the harshest winter had to bow to the sun. It was 6 months later, June of 1893, Blackwood Manor, once known as the tomb of a living ghost, had transformed. The heavy velvet drapes that had been drawn for 2 years were thrown open. Sunlight streamed into the great hall, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Not dust of neglect, but the dust of activity. In the gardens, a pony was trotting in a circle. "Keep your heels down, Leo. Just like that." Clarisse stood by the paddock fence, his arms crossed, a smile playing on his lips that would have been unrecognizable to the man he was 6 months ago. He wore a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the faint scars of the brawl in London. Leo, now filling out his clothes and looking every inch the young lord, gripped the reins of the Shetland pony. He was laughing, a sound that still stopped Clarisse in his tracks every time he heard it. The boy who had flinched at the sound of a falling spoon now rode with the wind in his hair. "He's a natural, Your Grace," Thomas the groundskeeper said, leaning on a rake nearby. "Got the Sterling balance." "He has his mother's courage," Clarisse corrected softly. He turned to look at the terrace. Lydia was sitting in a wicker chair, a blanket over her legs. Her recovery had been slow. The cold had damaged her lungs, and she walked with a cane, but her spirit was iron. In her arms, 6-month-old Clara was babbling, grabbing at the string of pearls around Lydia's neck. Clarisse walked up the stone steps. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hand. "You look tired," he said, scanning her face with the habitual worry that hadn't quite left him. "I'm happy," Lydia corrected him, leaning her cheek against his hand. "There is a difference. Did you receive the letter?" Clarisse's face hardened slightly. "I did." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy envelope with the seal of the crown. "Arthur has been sentenced," Clarisse said grimly. Transportation. 10 years in the penal colonies of Australia. Though given his soft hands and softer spine, I doubt he will last 2. Lydia looked out at the garden, her eyes shadowing for a moment. And the others? Dr. Thorne will never practice medicine again. He is in Bedlam, where he belongs, Clarice said, and as for the institute, that funded him. This was the final loose end. The investigation had revealed a disturbing truth. Dr. Thorne had been funded by a pseudo-scientific society in London obsessed with eugenics and pure bloodlines. They had targeted Lydia because her family history, combined with the Sterling line, fascinated them. It was a sick, twisted game of rich men playing God. I bought their debt, Clarice said, his voice dropping to a low growl. Every bank loan, every mortgage, held by the members of that society. I called them all in yesterday. They are bankrupt. The society is dissolved, their assets seized and their records burned. They can never hurt anyone again. Lydia squeezed his hand. You didn't just defeat them, Clarice. You erased them. I told you, he kissed her knuckles, I would burn the world for you. Bankrupting a few jagged old men was much easier. 2 weeks later, the gates of Blackwood Manor were thrown open for the first time in 3 years. It was the christening of Lady Clara Sterling and the official presentation of Lord Leo Sterling as the heir apparent. The invitation list was exclusive, yet vast. Curiosity drew them in. Every aristocrat in the north wanted to see if the rumors were true, if the ghost had really returned to the land of the living, and if the wife who rose from the dead was real. The ballroom was adorned with thousands of white roses, Lydia's favorite. The orchestra played a waltz. When the doors at the top of the staircase opened, the hush was immediate. Clarice stood there, resplendent in his formal dress uniform, the blue sash of his order across his chest. But no one was looking at the Duke. They were looking at the Duchess. Lydia wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that matched her husband's eyes. She held a cane made of ebony and silver, but she didn't lean on it. She used it as an accessory of power. She descended the stairs with her head held high, the scars of her ordeal hidden beneath her grace, but the strength of her survival visible in her eyes. Walking beside her was Leo, dressed in a miniature suit, holding his head up just like his father. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and the crowd parted. Lady Margaret, the local gossip who had once whispered that Clarice had killed his wife, stepped forward, looking flustered. "Your Grace," she stammered, curtsying low to Lydia. We are so overjoyed to see you return to health. It is a miracle." Lydia looked at the woman. She could have been cold. She could have been cruel. But she smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "It wasn't a miracle, Lady Margaret," Lydia said, her voice clear enough for the room to hear. "It was love, and a very long walk through the snow." She turned to Clarice. The orchestra swelled. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" she asked. "You may have every dance," Clarice replied, "for the rest of my life." He swept her onto the floor. As they spun, Lydia wincing slightly from the exertion, but laughing nonetheless, Clarice whispered in her ear, "You realize they are all terrified of you." "Good," Lydia whispered back. "Let them be terrified. It means they will never touch our children." "They wouldn't dare," Clarice vowed. "We are Sterlings. We survive the fire. We survive the ice." He looked over Lydia's shoulder to the corner of the room, where Leo was currently showing a group of awestruck children how to sneak tartlets from the buffet table. The boy caught his father's eye and grinned. Clarice tightened his hold on his wife. The nightmares of the asylum, the cold of the blizzard, the loneliness of the empty manor. It all faded into the music. The Duke had given shelter to a stranger in the snow, thinking he was saving her. But as he looked at his wife and his children, Clarice knew the truth. She was the one who had saved him. And that is the story of Clarice and Lydia, a reminder that sometimes the coldest winters bring the warmest springs. The Duke thought his life was over, locked away in grief. But fate brought him a second chance, wrapped in a tattered coat and a storm. It's a powerful testament to the idea that no matter how deep the betrayal or how dark the night, the truth has a way of fighting its way to the surface. Arthur Harrington thought he could bury his crimes, but he forgot that love is a force far more dangerous than greed. I hope you enjoyed this journey of heartbreak, revenge, and redemption. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more historical dramas like this one. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. And I have a question for you. If you were Clarice, would you have shown mercy to your cousin Arthur? Or would you have taken a darker revenge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, keep the fire burning.